The year is 1865, and this man right here is the President of the United States. His name is Abraham Lincoln, and he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves. Now, Lincoln is a great guy and widely considered to be the best U.S. president of all time. But this piece of crap over here is John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Abe Lincoln because he had the motive that doing so would restore Confederacy. So now, Andrew Johnson is president and certain laws were established, which brings me to the topic of this video, racial discrimination. So, these laws I was talking about earlier were the Jim Crow laws, which were originally the black codes, and they detailed when, where, and how former slaves could work. This meant that slaves were freed from slavery and basically put right back into it in the same year, since African Americans were assigned their work, except this time they actually got paid. What was good about it, though, was that African Americans still had some freedoms, such as the right to buy property, marry, make contracts, and testify in court. Over the next few years, the 14th and 15th Amendments were ratified, which granted citizenship to former slaves and the right to vote. White Southerners were disgusted by the fact that African Americans had all of these rights and freedoms, and they wanted to retain their white supremacy. Fast forward a bit to the 1880s and the 1890s, where the progressive era is just starting out and the Jim Crow laws are being enforced in the South. These laws segregated African Americans from pretty much every public place. There were signs everywhere reminding everyone that these laws were in place. Apparently, these laws would give African Americans separate but equal rights. But in actuality, African Americans got the bare minimum, and their facilities were always inferior to the white facilities. To make things even worse, African Americans were denied the right to vote in the South, which meant they couldn't even make a change to these rights no matter how hard they tried. Okay. As you can probably tell, this period of time was extremely unfair towards African Americans and how much the South discriminated against them. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 overturned the Jim Crow laws. That's right, they were revoked about 75 years after first being enforced. Now, let's fast forward to today, where the Jim Crow laws are dead, slavery is long gone, and we recently had our first black president. So, what's racial discrimination against African Americans like today? Definitely isn't as bad as it was back then, but it's still not at all good. One example is the Black Lives Matter movement. Which campaigns against violence and systemic? What does that even mean? Why did I write this down? One example is the Black Lives Matter movement, which campaigns against violence and systemic racism towards African Americans, since there are some cases where police are unnecessarily brutal towards African Americans. Along with people still being racist in general, racial discrimination is still around, but it's good to see it has finally improved since the 19th and 20th century. I only covered a couple examples in this video, but there are lots of other ways people are and have been discriminated against based on their race, not just African Americans. The U.S. is supposed to be the melting pot of the world where people of any race or community live here and fit in, not to come here and be hated on by a bunch of white people. So, I don't know how to end this, so I'm gonna just go edit this. Goodbye.